Hi everybody, I'm Barry Hirshorn. I have spent 30 years in earthquakes and tsunami warning. I was with the USGS Earthquake Hazards Program for 10 years, real-time earthquake monitoring, and the beginnings of earthquake early warning. And I spent 20 years at the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii as a duty scientist and as a person who was bringing in scientific advances in seismology into the warning system that could save lives, to do with things like the size of the earthquake and so forth, and how fast and how quickly we can get those to the closest coast and save the most lives. That's where I am now. That's what I've been specializing on, and I'm still working on that sort of stuff. I wanted to start out this presentation by just kind of the bottom line up front. And I should give credit where credit's due. This was reinforced recently by watching another video in this series done by Emil Akal. And his bottom line message couldn't be more true from my perspective in the field for 30 years, which is education, education, education. That's the same number of times he said it as well. And basically the idea here is it's extremely helpful to understand the hazard, have some feeling for how to respond and prepare ahead of time to the hazard, and then when it actually happens, what to do. And the more you understand it, the more you're prepared, and the more you've sort of perhaps even rehearsed what to do, you have extremely high odds, in spite of where you live, to do very well, to probably survive, you and your family. But anyway, that's kind of the bottom line. And I really want to try and hammer that home if possible. So anyway, now I'll get into what I have to say in a little more detail than that, which is basically that's behind everything I'm doing. Essentially, one of the things that we learned from Tohoku, which was, as you know, a massive quake, was that the entire subduction zone can rupture at once, and even when unexpected, as it was there. There in Cascadia, for you folks, it's a scenario that the whole rupture zone could go, or some part of it. So essentially you've got, let's say, three threats. You've got the threat from an event off of the southern part of Alaska, which you'll have a little more warning time to prepare for, which could also be quite a large tsunami from a very large earthquake. And then you've got what we would call the near field or close in threat from your own faults, most notably the Cascadia area from the subduction zones offshore. And what Tohoku taught us was that whole zone could break at once, or the top half could break, or the bottom half could break. If the bottom half breaks in what's called a megathrust subduction earthquake, you'll get plenty of natural warning. You'll get plenty of strong ground shaking, and you can use that in the absence of anything else, and should, because it may be the first thing you get. But the other thing Tohoku has showed us is the top part of that. The very upper section of that same fault could break by itself. And that might not be a 9, it might be an 8 or something that could still produce a huge tsunami, but you won't get the strong ground shaking that you might otherwise think will be your warning. I want to re-emphasize that. You may not feel any strong ground shaking before a gigantic tsunami. The science has advanced to the point where the warning centers, PTWC can warn you for that, ahead of time for that, because we have methods now in place that will see these earthquakes, and the official warning that you'll get through the Weather Service, communications lines and so forth, or somehow, will include hopefully a warning for that scenario. So the point being, you may not get a natural warning in that case, and then you fall back to an official warning from the warning center, which may be the first thing you'll get. Don't be dissuaded by the fact, I haven't felt much shaking, so not much to worry about, because these treacherous tsunami quakes, as Hiro Kanamori named them, are dangerous because you don't feel them, and they produce we have many examples, huge tsunamis, and hardly anyone feels much shaking at all. So I also want to hammer that one across to you. So anyway, moving on to the next part of what I'm saying. Basically, this is a technical talk, so to speak. And so we, as a seismologist, the things that I deal with, and there's essentially been a revolution in seismology and in GPS that have coincided in the decades since, in the decade, I should say, since the '04 quake, and in the time since the decade since the '04 Sumatra, as well as Japan. Essentially, after every very large earthquake, it spawns huge interest and research interest and progress. So we're after things like, how big is the earthquake, its magnitude, how does it break? Does it break in a dangerous thrust type motion, or does it simply strike sides, strikes that we call that the mechanism? And then the other thing that we're after is, what does the actual slip look like on the fault? Because that drives the ocean bottom, which drives the tsunami. So those are three key scientific / technical things that we try to understand. And there's been vast progress understanding all of the above more accurately and much more quickly than ever before. I mean, it's in an accelerated phase now. So now I'll jump back to before, or I should say partway through that acceleration, because the '04 Sumatra earthquake started that process in earnest. And by the time the Tohoku quake came around, we were in a position, we had actually just implemented one of these 3 months before the earthquake, and it produced we were able to actually test it and use it successfully, I might add, during the quake. Anyway, so if you can imagine, this is what actually happened on that day at the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center for the Tohoku quake, the Japanese earthquake in 2011. About 1 minute and 34 seconds after the earthquake started, the duty scientists were paged by an automatic system that senses the motion through seismometers. A full minute after we got our first notice, the shaking ended. Now that might seem a little odd, but we're not dealing with a quake that size. We're talking about 2.5 minutes of rupture. And so we were actually notified before the earthquake was over, very quickly. And that can be done even faster now, but I'll go on that later. The Japan Meteorological Agency issued a earthquake early warning, essentially, with an underestimate of the magnitude at 7.9. And they issued that at about 2 minutes, 40 seconds after the beginning of the rupture, or only something like 10 seconds after the rupture ended, very quickly. However, that 7.9 meant it wasn't as much of a warning as it could have been. It probably saved many lives because it stopped their bullet trains from running before the strong ground shaking hit the railway system. And it provided 30 seconds of warning to Tokyo, which is a very large population center. And this certainly saved probably thousands of lives. That would not be an underestimate. Very similar to the earthquake early warning systems that are now being deployed in the Northwest here. At that point, PTWC prepared their first bulletin, we'll say, that went out to the world at large. And this is at about 8.5 minutes after the beginning of rupture, or 5 or 6 minutes after the end of rupture. We went out with Japan, as per standard operating procedure. Requirement, even though we didn't know any better, really, was to go out. I should say the warning center had to go out with a 7.9, but it was a tsunami warning for Japan, Russia, the Marcus Islands, Northern Marianas, areas closer to the earthquake. It's something like, I want to say, an hour after the earthquake began, a new method, which had just been installed 3 months ahead of time, called the W phase, and due to work by Hiro Kanamori, who discovered it in 1993, Kanamori, Louis Rivera, and wrote a paper that essentially was the guide on how to apply it for a warning center in 2008. And then themselves plus Zach Dupatel, also from the same organization in France, implemented these with the help of PTWC scientists, myself included, in early December, 3 months before the Tohoku earthquake hit. And at this point, at 1 hour after the earthquake had begun, it reported something much closer to the true side of the earthquake, as it should, of an 8.8. It wasn't a 9, it was an 8.8 at this point. And we also had an idea of the mechanism, as I mentioned, that we were dealing with a subduction zone, red flag, danger, maximum potential earthquake. We do this at 1 hour, keep that 1 hour mark in mind. And then, let's see, at that point, we prepared a second bulletin, and essentially got that message out that there was an 8.8. So that is what happened then. This is 10 years ago. This is 2011 for the Tohoku earthquake. And I'd like to give you a little snapshot of what would happen now, given the advances since then. The most important of which is the fact that that magnitude 8.8 that approached the true size of the earthquake, that was available to the public at about an hour after the Tohoku earthquake, today would be available for a Cascadia quake or an Alaska earthquake or any huge subduction zone earthquake within more like 10 to 15 minutes because of advances made. The scientific world coming soon is 5 to 10 minutes, 5 to 10. But right now, the Warning Center has implemented, PTWC has implemented a 10 to 15 minute version of this W phase for the size of the earthquake and how it broke, the mechanism for the nearest coasts before this tsunami arrived, which is more like 20 to 30 minutes, assuming a megathrust or a slow event. So that's a big deal. The other thing that's on the cusp, I'll say, isn't implemented yet, is the combination of seismic data and geodetic data, now a faster version of which is called GNSS data. Yehuda Bach at Scripps, and he's one of many players who are using geodetic only and geodetic and seismic, but in particular for the combination of geodetic and seismic together, it's called seismogeodetic. And this data gives us all the advantages of both earthquake seismogeodetic data, geodetic data and seismic data. So PTWC is on the cusp of being able to exploit that. Both warning centers are on the cusp in a slightly longer time frame of using GPS and seismic, I believe for Cascadia, but that's still, I don't know, but it's on the way. It's being developed, and that involves both centers and is probably a year away, maybe. I don't know. You have to talk to the people involved in that. So the potential there now is for what we did in 09 in 10 minutes, in an hour, and in 2011 for the magnitude 9, and what we can do now of a magnitude 10, of 10 minutes, happening within 5 minutes. In some cases, having the magnitude using the GPS plus the seismic data together before the rupture ends. And this will certainly provide maximal, accurate, and fast warning for the near field, people in Cascadia and where you are on the Northwest coast.